Hey everyone, I'm Kate Kennedy and I'm here with day 12 of 100 Days of Kane, PA. And I know a lot of you have been asking about stories from our lumber history. And so today we're talking with Judy Cook to tell the story about how Novosel Lumber Company came to Kane. So I'm going to go ahead and flip you around and we're going to go inside and hear from Judy about how the lumber industry in her family got started and how she has memories of that time. Hello.
Hi, Kate.
How are you?
Great. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having us here today. Could you tell us, we've had a lot of people asking, let's hear some stories about the lumber history here because it's such a big part of our identity. So we thought we would talk to you, and we're wondering if you would start by telling the story of how your family even got here and into the industry at all.
Okay. Well, a lot of what I can go by is my Aunt Mary or Aunt Rose did a history. And from her history, my grandfather, Nikola Novosel, came over from Croatia when he was 14. He left Croatia because there was a chance that he was going to be put into the army. And so his uncle dressed him up in American clothes and sent him over. He ended up in St. Mary's, and then eventually came to Kane because he was sick and had a cough and saw Dr. O'Neill Kane, and Dr. O'Neill Kane said, "You better move to Kane." So he was here for a few years and then decided to go back to Croatia. Went back, married my grandmother, Barbara, and there was a chance that he was going to get locked up because he had left the country, so he came back. My grandmother, Barbara, in that time, that after they got married, she had a baby, and Barbara and my uncle Nick lived in Croatia for 4 years. Grandpa said, "You better come over to America or we're just going to forget this whole thing." And so Grandma and Uncle Nick came over on a cattle boat. The story goes that she was in the hull of the boat with my Uncle Nick, who was 4, and there were cattle all around, and it was a 30-day trip. And one of my aunts said that she had told the story about climbing up a ladder from the hull of the boat to go up and see sunshine, and Nick was on her back, and she slipped and fell, and somebody caught her.
Oh my God.
Otherwise, I don't know if Uncle Nick would have made it.
Wow.
But anyhow, she landed in New York City with a tag around her neck and a tag around Uncle Nick's neck that said Kane, Pennsylvania. And they got somebody put them on a train, and they came by train to Kane, and a man in a livery stable picked them up and took them with his horse and carriage back into Sackett, where my grandfather was living at that time, and he met them at the post office in Sackett and took them to where they live.
And this was the early 1900s?
Yes, she was 18 at that time, so it would have been let me get my little cheat sheet out here. Yeah, early 1900s. She might have been 18 or 1920.
Oh my
something
gosh,
like that.
what courage and bravery she
Oh,
had.
I know.
To
Well,
take a 4-year-old with her
yes,
across the ocean.
across the ocean and not knowing anybody other than her husband.
Oh wow.
So she gets there, and he takes them to her new home. And her new home was a log camp where she quickly, at 18, learned to cook, sew, and clean and live with 30 men.
Oh my gosh.
God bless her. And she was definitely a matriarch. I mean, knowing her, she was the boss, she was the strong lady.
Yeah.
So they had lived in Sackett for a while. Then they moved to Owl's Nest, and they moved to other places around the area. Grandpa worked on the railroad and in log camps, doing lots of odd jobs. As they continued and moved to different places, more and more kids came, ending up with 12 children, 8 boys and 4 girls, all of which were born in different places. like my father, Frank, number 5, that's him right there with the flower pot on his head, was born in Watermill in a log camp.
Oh, wow.
The majority of them were, I think only one, the youngest, George, was born in a hospital, and I think everybody else was born in a log camp. So Grandma was definitely a strong woman, and I can remember Dad saying, you have a baby one day and you're out in the garden the next. Can't imagine that nowadays.
Nope.
So they moved from place to place. Then when the Depression came, there was no work around here. So they went up to New York State and lived in a couple different places, doing whatever they could possibly do. The kids would go out and get jobs picking blueberries or doing whatever and selling the blueberries. And of course, every penny went to the family. I can remember my dad telling a story of I think it was when they lived in Glenfield, New York, during Prohibition, that in order to help the family continue to live, that my grandmother would sew pockets inside of their jackets. And they had a still, and they made moonshine, and Grandma would send the little 12, 14, and 15-year-olds down to the town where they would have parties, and the little boys would be selling moonshine. And people would know, oh, there comes the Novosel boys. They're going to have little presents for us. And sure enough, they'd open up and run back and pass each other on the way.
How did they end up back in Keene then?
Well, they had a farm before they moved up to New York State in Lamont. And they mortgaged that out and had somebody renting it for them when they had to go to New York State. So eventually things seemed to be getting better. The Depression was over, and they decided to come back to the farm. When they came back, they found that it was kind of in shambles. So they worked really hard at different jobs all over the place. I think Uncle Nick went to Ohio and worked somewhere and sent all his money back home. Eventually they got the farm up running, making some money. Grandpa was working in the logging, working for people. They saved money, and eventually they decided, let's start the Novosel Lumber Yard. They built up things. Back then, everybody worked for them. Aunt Rose did the books, Aunt Mary did books, and then they'd have other jobs at the shirt factories and things like that, and they'd give money home. So even my Aunt Ann, who passed away not too long ago, told me a story about she didn't live with the family. She lived in town and babysat, so she could help make money for the family and send money back.
So the whole family really came together to make this logging company work.
Exactly.
This lumber company work.
Yeah. And after a while, back in I believe it was 51, I believe, my father, Frank, Carl, and Steve went together and they bought the lumber company from my grandfather. Nick had his own business, and some of the others were still in logging, but didn't actually help with the lumber company once the three bought that. They had, it was interesting too, because they basically did it all. They owned land. They logged from their own land. They logged from other lands. They had their own trucks. They had their bulldozers. They'd bring the logs into the lumber yard. They soaked the logs in the log pond, and it's my understanding that helped the bark come off. And they also had a planing mill, and they made lumber. And so from start to finish, it was a whole operation.
Wow.
I don't think you saw that in all the places. Some places were just logging companies, or some places were sawmills, but they
From
did it
start to
all.
finish.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, how impressive. Do you have memories of any time that you spent in the lumber yard?
I do. We I lived right there in the farmhouse that my grandfather and grandmother lived in, and we had a big garage and stuff like that, and it was loud. It was noisy with the sawmill going, and of course I was curious, and I was never allowed to go down in there. But of course you sneak around every once in a while. But we used to. The family was a big family, and it was important to get everybody together at least once a year. So we'd have gigantic 4th of July parties. Got to be like almost 200 people. Everybody would bring food. We even raised lambs, and I thought they were my pets until they turned up to be on the spit. But one time, I don't know, I was maybe 10, 12 or something, myself and 2 of my cousins got on a bulldozer in the garage. It was a big garage. And we said, 1, 2, 3, go. And we all pushed buttons, and didn't it start up? And you saw people scrambling. Needless to say, we were never allowed on that bulldozer again. But it was, you remember things like that.
Yeah. And the log yard is not around. Is it functional now? Or?
No, it's not. It's in Lamont. The lumber company split. Carl, Steve, and Frank split in, I'm going to say, 1967, 68. I think the reason, and they're very wise men, Frank, my dad, only had me, and he knew that I wasn't interested in logging. Carl had a son that had passed away and had a daughter, and she wasn't interested in the logging. And Steve's children, he had 2 girls and a boy, and they just decided that instead of, if anything would happen to the 3 of those brothers, they didn't want any arguing between cousins. So they split, and they split very happily. They were all happy with how they split. Very wise.
Very wise.
Very wise.
But also such an important piece of Kane's history. They really contributed to making Kane the place that it is through their industry and through their grit and hard work. And it's just awesome to hear those stories.
And they were very, they were philanthropic, but they did not want to have people know that. They were kind of quiet in their donations.
Yeah, supporting the town.
Great.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's such a great legacy to have. And I feel, we have Log Yard uptown, the brewery with Royce now to continue the stories and the memories in a different sort of way, but still keeping the legacy alive. So,
and he has some very interesting pictures up there that when I first saw them, even though I gave him some of the pictures, it got to me.
Yeah. Before we end, do you have any other stories specifically about your dad that you'd like to share?
Oh, he was a pretty wise guy. When you're growing up and you're young, you hear these stories and you think, oh yeah, and boy, I really wish I would have paid attention. But I think he left. He always told me, Judy, never be afraid to ask a question. And anybody that knows me now, especially my boss, probably thought, oh, wish he would have never heard that one, because I always asked questions. He said, be very careful with water, because it's going to be scarce and it will get polluted. And I think with the drilling and stuff that we have nowadays, we do have to be careful with that. And he said, save your land, because, quote, they'll all want to come back, unquote. And all you youngins are doing that. It's just wonderful.
Well, and you went away to school and then you decided to come back, and this is where you made your life. What made you come back?
Oh, that's interesting. Right after high school, I had 2 friends who were a year older than me, and we decided to go to Atlantic City and work. That was before the casinos, thank goodness. Who knows what I would have got into then. But we went down there, and I had a great time, and it was very interesting. But I thought, Well, in August of that year, that was 69, I got a call that my grandmother was very ill and I needed to come home. So I came home and I looked around and I thought, it hit me what was missing. What was missing was the green. And I guess I never realized how beautiful it was here. And Ron and I, my husband, we've taken trips. We've gone to Alaska, and it's beautiful there, and seen other mountains, and been to Yellowstone, and it's still all here. It's just here.
This is the place to come home to.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. Is there anything else you want to say before we leave?
No, I just, I guess to the younger folks, listen to the stories your parents tell you, because you'll want to know them.
Well, thank you, Judy. This was
Thanks,
a great
Kate.
story. We'll go ahead and say, if you got, we were talking about the lumber business and logging, and the log trucks, even today, are still very prevalent and part of how we know we're home. And so in the comments, if you have other ideas of ways that you're in Kane, please share them there, because Kane has a really special and unique history, things that make it, you just know you're here when you see it. So go ahead and comment, and we'll be back tomorrow with day 13. Thanks for tuning in. Talk to you soon.